Today's webinar topic is what to expect when you're thinking about converting your existing SAP Business One from SQL to SAP Business One and HANA. And for some companies, this will be different than for others. So I'm going to take you through kind of what to expect. And I've indicated that this webinar is part one. So what we're not going to see today is we're not going to talk in depth about HANA specific functionality. We'll definitely brush on it. You know, I do want to talk about what some of the differences are. You know, to draw out some of the requirements you'd have as far as gaining knowledge. You know, things that you would get from HANA, and we may, you know. Please fill out the survey at the end of the webinar, because if you do feel that you'd like sort of a part two of this webinar that's more focused on a deeper dive on what's in HANA, we'd be happy to do that. So today's webinar is truly focused on what the requirements are and what really you should expect as far as effort and costs when it comes to various aspects of converting from SQL to HANA. So we'll talk specifically about some of the licensing requirements, infrastructure requirements. So when I say infrastructure, I mean things like the servers that it runs on and the clients that run the application. So, you know, your laptop or your desktop computer, whatnot. And then what are some of the data migration requirements? Okay, so first of all, we'll talk a little bit about what the licensing requirements are. So if you're currently a company that runs SAP Business One on Microsoft SQL, any of the professional licenses you have for the SQL version or the limited licenses or other will convert directly to HANA licensing. So that means if you're a company that has one professional user and you'd like to convert that to a HANA system, your professional user will be flipped over from SQL to HANA. However, you will now be required to purchase the HANA database component. So what is this roughly analogous to? Well, it's roughly analogous or equivalent to the license that you buy for SQL, because really, you know, you need a database platform to run this on, just as you would on SQL. So typically, SQL Server is sold on a per user or per processor core. You know, I think we're typically quoting currently SQL per processor core. I think the last time I may have quoted SQL or gotten a third party to quote SQL, that was something that was around, you know, $4,500 per processor core. I think per set of, I think it comes in a 2-core block. SQL. Don't quote me on that. We could certainly find that information, but just so that you know, to buy the basic version of SQL is in the same really ballpark, maybe even a little more than what it is to buy sort of the first block of HANA. And HANA, instead of being sold per user or per processor core, is sold per 64 gigabyte block of RAM in the system that you're running it on. Why 64? Well, it's sort of the size or the block of RAM that it's been decided upon that you know, run in increments. So typically when you have a HANA system, you'll have one that's got a minimum of 64 gigabytes. I don't know that it's recommended that you run on less, but a 64 gigabyte HANA system will typically support up to about 25 users. And we can kind of talk about how it goes up from there. Okay, so those are some of the licensing requirements. Obviously, if you've got a bigger HANA system and you want more RAM, for instance, if you've got a 40-user system, the documentation would recommend that you're at more of a level of, like, say, 96 gigabytes in your server. That means that you're going to have to buy the second block, which would enable you to go up to a total of 128 gigabytes in your HANA system. So you see how that works. It's sort of sold per block of RAM instead of per processor core. And this would be the same thing if you were doing it with SQL. Like if you've got a very large SAP Business One system with 100 users, you'll probably have more than just the first block of SQL. You'll likely have at least 2 or 3 blocks to support more users. All right. So flipping over to what the infrastructure requirements are. So you have to purchase that HANA database license. You also have to have a server that runs SUSE Linux. So HANA is a database engine that runs on a Linux operating system, not Windows, and a lot of the components around SAP Business One HANA will also run on Linux, but we'll see examples of things that don't. But if you want to run Business One HANA on-premise, you're going to require a Linux server, and you're going to require a copy of SUSE Linux Enterprise, I believe, as it's called. Most likely, you're going to purchase this license for SUSE Linux Enterprise server when you buy the server that it's meant to run on. Just like if you were buying a server to run SQL, you'd likely buy a Windows server or a virtual server with Microsoft Windows Server and Microsoft SQL, and it might even be pre-installed as part of the purchase. So that's what's kind of most likely happening. If you want to run this on-premise, there are some very specific infrastructure requirements, and there is a certified hardware matrix. So let's kind of take a look at that really quickly. It used to be, when this first came out, when HANA was first a thing, that there was really only one brand name of server appliance that you can buy, and I believe the first one was a Fujitsu server. Now, there are a number of different vendors available. So you can see that there are some certified Lenovo, some certified Fujitsu, HP, even Huawei. I'm going to look at the Dell in particular. This is not meant as a specific endorsement. It's just that Dell seems to be more in our world. It seems to be more common, the server. But you could pick any of these according to, you know, your likes or what your IT partner will work with. And when we select Dell, we can even filter the list further, but a very common server would be the R630, R730 range. And if we look here, there's a number of certified configurations, and the configurations are sort of grouped by the amount of RAM in the server, and that 64 gigabytes is sort of the minimum amount. It's sort of the starting point. Or if we click on this one that's the 96 gigabyte, we can see that here's a certified configuration. So you really do want to follow the certified configurations for HANA. Okay, and that information is all available to you. There's even a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet that gives you the specific bill of materials of what's in the server that we can provide you with. This is sort of like a generic guide to what model names are certified. There's even a specific spreadsheet that'll tell you exactly what CPUs should be in this configuration, you know, how much RAM and in what configuration, what the hard drive array should look like, so, you know, what types of hard drives and in what type of RAID controller. It gets as specific as that. Okay, so that's a little bit about hardware, and we're going to talk about kind of the bottom line stuff here right away. Business One HANA, so when I say that, I mean the client version of HANA, so not the server, is still a Windows application. So you still require a Windows-based operating system to run the SAP Business One HANA client. So that means that if you're running on your native laptop and you're connecting to a local server, you can just run it on your Windows 10 or what have you. And newer versions of Business One is supported on Windows 10. If you're using, you know, kind of a terminal services or an application servers type of environment, you do require a Windows terminal server to serve out the Business One HANA client. Okay, I see there's a question there, so I'm just going to pause now that we've sort of... Oh yes, the link for the hardware into the chat. Yes, that's no problem. Actually, that was asked by one of our internal people. The other thing that we'll do is we'll publish not just the slide deck and the demo, but we could even publish some supplementary material to our website as resources for people that are looking to know more.
Yep, absolutely. We'll get that up today after the
Yeah.
session.
Now, one thing to note, this is something that we've sort of encountered in our own testing. If you know, if you know a lot about running SAP Business One database server on SQL, you'll know that of course, that currently runs in a Windows Server environment, and the core database is on Microsoft SQL, but there are other services that run on the Windows system that, like the system landscape and the messaging system. Some of these services have a Linux equivalent. So what I mean by that is the system landscape can be made to run on the SUSE Linux server. But there are a couple of these services, like say for instance the DI server service, that, and I may be corrected on this, there may be an update recently, but at least in the beginning, this service still had to run in a Windows OS environment. I probably can't answer the question whether that needs to be Windows Server or not, but really what we're driving at here is that when you want to run your own on-premise environment of HANA, and let's say you're running the SUSE Linux HANA server on a virtualized environment, and you're also running an application server, some of those services that are around the Business One application do require the Windows Server environment. So you may not be able to trim down to just one VM if you're kind of strictly going client server. We can talk to you more about that if you want to know more. Okay, Jaylene, I saw one other question pop up there, but I just, do you see it?
No, I think it's just the one. So I've pasted the link to that hardware matrix in the chat if anyone wants to take a closer look at it.
Thank you. And like I say, there is also a link, and sometimes as your partner we have resources available to us in the back end that aren't necessarily always customer facing, but suffice it to say, if any of the customers out there want to take a deeper look at this, we'll find ways to get some of this information into your hands, because obviously this is something that we believe that you should be able to be internally enabled on as well, and we're there to help you. Okay, so the lowdown on infrastructure requirements for an SAP HANA server, really you want to stay with certified hardware configurations. We have certainly run uncertified hardware configurations just for fun in test environments, and they work okay, but HANA server likes lots of RAM. Obviously we don't want to go below the minimum specification for that. It likes lots of processor cores, so even for some of those configurations we were looking at there, you're looking at configurations that have in upwards of 20 to 30 processor cores just for the HANA server. And it's definitely picky about the types of hard drives and the RAID configuration that those hard drives are in. Okay, and as mentioned, some services still require a Windows OS platform. Like at last I knew DI server was one of those types of services. Okay, so far so good. Okay, moving into the data migration requirements. So there's a couple of things that you'll need to prepare yourself for if you're looking to kind of migrate your existing SQL database into HANA database. And there are some migration tools available for this, and there's even a little bit of a guide or a how-to or a cookbook that I believe I'm allowed to share with you in order to do this. So if this was something that you were looking at tackling, there's really a couple of main components. You're going to need to do a conversion on your main database schema from SQL to HANA, and you're also going to have to convert any of the custom queries in your current Business One environment into HANA queries. Now, how is it really different? How is SQL language and HANA language really different? Because when you start working in HANA, you'll quickly recognize that HANA sort of uses a very similar syntax. In fact, they sort of refer to it almost as SQL language within the HANA Studio environment. I'll show you what I mean in a second. But it's slightly different in the sense that HANA the query language used in the HANA environment is case sensitive, and in SQL they're typically not. So there are places where case matters, and that's really probably what underlies the majority of the things that need to be converted between the two. You know, things like schema names will sometimes be written in upper and lower case in SQL, and that case may not matter when you're writing queries and statements and that kind of stuff. It does matter in HANA. Okay, so we're just going to quickly take a look at. Sorry, forgive me. I'm. One second, if you bear with me. I'm going to show you the. How-to guide that we're talking about. And I believe this is something that we can post and share, but I'll just check with my colleagues at SAP before we stick it up on the website. Okay, so you should be seeing an Excel sheet here. This Excel sheet was put out there by SAP, and it's a bit of a step-by-step guide. It's not very detailed, but it does provide links to find further documentation on the steps. So, you know, talking about identifying the migration path from one system to the next, etc., installing SUSE Linux and some further resources on that. So this, it's being called a cookbook. This is a good guide, and this is certainly the guide that our consulting and sysadmin teams would be using to kind of help convert a system from one to the next. So again, this is certainly something that Project Line can do for you, or if you're thinking of tackling on your own as an end user, you know, we can help provide the resources to do this. Okay, so that data migration could be very light, and you know, if you're running a very standardized version of Business One where you haven't done a lot of tweaks or changes, there's not a lot of UDFs, there's not a lot of custom queries, the migration might be actually fairly straightforward. It may be sort of in the order of magnitude of what it would take to do a regular upgrade from one major version to the next. But the migration could also be fairly long, and so depending on how many custom queries you have, and if you have any customizations in the system using the software development kit, the other thing you want to watch out for with respect to migration is any major add-ons. So if you're running a big add-on, you want to understand, you know, does that add-on support HANA? Most of them do, or at least they're getting there. But that's certainly something that you want to look at before kind of getting in really deep with data migration. Okay, the last thing we'll sort of cover is some of the knowledge requirements around HANA. And really, when I say knowledge requirements, I'm sort of talking about the things that you'll have to learn, but also some of the new stuff that you'll want to learn and leverage as part of the system. And as I say, this certainly isn't a dive deep on HANA functionality, but we're going to see a little bit of it just so that you understand kind of what's involved in the learning curve. So obviously, one of the knowledge requirements if you want to run your own on-premise HANA system would be you likely going to want somebody who is just as adept at administrating SUSE Linux operating system as they are in running Windows Server operating system. And obviously there's a learning curve. There's lots of documentation and support with SUSE Linux, particularly if you have the paid-for purchased copy of SUSE Linux Enterprise Server. You have access to support, all that good stuff. HANA Studio. So what is HANA Studio? Well, HANA Studio is roughly equivalent to what you probably already know as SQL Management Studio if you're running Business One and SQL. So it's the program that is in charge of your database and schema management, backup, data modeling, and kind of system health and alerts. So we'll very quickly go over to HANA here. We'll take a quick look at HANA Studio, and just a very quick look. So here's HANA Studio when you log in. visually looks, a fair bit different than SQL Management Studio, although once you start to get down into it, it starts to look the same. We have our HANA server system here, and on this page here we've got some health parameters tracked. Like right now, here's the memory usage. We've got alerts popping up. So it does enable you to kind of monitor the services running on your server and their health and the resource load, these types of things. Okay, and then if we open up this folder here, here's a view that will start to look familiar. These are all of the database schemas that exist. So in our particular demo system, we've got the good old-fashioned SAP Business One Demo CA, Demo US, the OAC Computers database that we're logged into. Of course, here's the SAP Business One Common database schema, and anything else around that. So there's where the schemas are located, and of course if we drill down we see very similar things that we'd expect to see on SQL, the table structure, whatnot. HANA Studio requires its own learning, so obviously it's a tool that it's a tool that you would have to get used to just as you would SQL Management Studio. Okay, and maybe a little bit different than SQL Management Studio, HANA has some advanced tools that allows for data modeling, kind of the building of views, some graphical tools. We're not going to get into that today, but that's an important part of HANA Studio, and one that certainly we'll be running webinars on in the future. Okay, I just see all right. So we'll just switch back here. Okay, what are the knowledge requirements of Business One? There's a few kind of major things in HANA and a few minor things. So we should point out that all of the fundamental business logic of SAP Business One, whether it be on the SQL side or the HANA side, it's consistent. But there are a few things that are in SAP Business One HANA that don't exist in SQL, and it's because of it's because of the new HANA database structure that SAP has said, well, there's some things that we're able to more easily do with HANA that we're going to design for. So this is the difference. This is the differentiator, and these are the reasons why you would likely switch between one or another. One of the major things, of course, being the pervasive analytics. So the ability to sort of build your own key performance metric visualizations and dashboards and all that kind of stuff. In the SQL version, you're likely using a standard version of the dashboard, and there are tools that allow you to build a custom version, but they're not as easy to use as the tools in HANA. I'll say this right now. So this is potentially a compelling reason to switch. There are some advanced dashboards in HANA that don't exist in the SQL version. So the advanced available to promise dashboard, the advanced cash flow dashboard, and something called the delivery schedule. When it comes to inventory planning, there is functionality in HANA that doesn't exist in SQL. So if any of you out there do advanced inventory planning with an algorithm that essentially analyzes your past sales and purchasing history and identifies trends in your data, those were things that typically we would rely on and add on from, say, Achieve IT or Velogix or whatever to apply that advanced algorithm. There's some of those algorithms now being built into the HANA version of the inventory planning module. And of course, one of the other major ones being the Excel interactive analysis. Just had the question, can HANA be run on a virtual server? Absolutely. In fact, that's what we would recommend. When it first started out, there was quite a large performance hit between running HANA on bare metal versus running it virtualized. Now the performance hit, and I'd be corrected if I'm wrong, but I believe it's sort of in about the 10% range. So there's a difference between running it bare metal and virtualized, but for the most part, that performance hit doesn't have any doesn't typically have any visible effects on kind of end user experience, and the advantages to virtualizing will typically outweigh the disadvantages to running it on bare metal, if that makes sense. So yes, it can be virtualized. I believe our sysadmin team would tell me that VMware is required to virtualize HANA. So we've got experience, a little experience with that. We also have a lot of experience with Hyper-V, but at this time I don't believe that Hyper-V is supported as a method for virtualizing SAP HANA. Okay, we're going to quickly switch over to HANA. I just want to highlight those things that we said. So if you look at a dashboard for HANA, you'll often notice in HANA demos there's quite a fair more number of KPIs and things, and these KPIs, there's a lot more of them that come out of the box with HANA, but these are also extremely easy to build, and there's an area of HANA here called Pervasive Analytics, and if I crack it open, and again today's not meant to be really a deep dive on this, but here's where you design your own KPIs and your own dashboards, and it is quite easy to do from a kind of a power user, end user perspective now. I think if I scroll to the bottom, there's even some of these dashboards are ones that I've created for demonstration in this system. And so that's what's behind that. It's a much more user-friendly tool than sort of the existing dashboard designer in the SQL version of the Crystal dashboard designer, the Excelsius. So definitely the way you want to go if you want to build your own dashboard content. The second thing we'd sort of talked about is some of the advanced dashboards. So you'll notice some buttons here in the ribbon bar off to the right-hand side that weren't available in the SQL version. So the available to promise check, the delivery schedule management, the advanced cash flow. These are advanced dashboards that are only available in HANA. So the cash flow forecast, there is cash flow forecasting in your SQL version, but not to the same extent. Not with the slider bar, not with the advanced configuration on certainty level and that sort of thing. Not without, of course, kind of custom logic or custom query. So that's an example of something that's coming with HANA, and obviously there is some learning involved in being able to leverage. But if you're the kind of company that in particular is a distribution style company, this available to promise check or this delivery schedule manager, these are very nice things that are now being built as standard in the product that may very well be a good reason to switch from SQL to HANA. Okay. I think maybe we'll skip over, sorry, I'm going to have to skip over the advanced inventory stuff just because I don't know that I have it enabled in the system, but I'll end with the, we'll do another webinar later on the specific kind of showcasing the specific functionality. One of the last things being Excel interactive analysis. So one of the things that SAP has done is they've added this tool that allows you to kind of port data into Excel automatically. It's essentially sort of like having data in a cube and getting it into Excel, and we can certainly do versions of this in the SQL version of Business One. It's just not out of the box. So now they've included some out-of-the-box data cubes. So for instance, if we wanted to launch the purchase analysis, Excel interactive analysis, we click on that, it opens it up in Excel, and it opens it up in sort of a pivot table style. So we can select, say, net purchase amount as our value and see it by certain dimension, and this is all live linked to the database. So not a really heavy feature when it comes to learning, but definitely a very nice feature, and there's probably a little bit of exploration involved in kind of understanding what that can do for you. Okay, so those are some of the key things that you'll have to learn, or that you'll probably want to leverage if you're looking at going from SQL to HANA. So what are some of the bottom line things to sort of kind of bring it back around and summarize? What should we be prepared for as far as efforts and costs? So obviously on the licensing side, we should be prepared for at least a $3,000 purchase on the HANA server component for the first chunk. If we're looking at running this on-premise, you're likely looking at spending anywhere in the neighborhood of $15,000 to $35,000 depending on your configuration and your layout on a server. Why such a broad range? Well, you know, if you were just looking for a server that ran SAP Business One HANA kind of in a bare metal way, that may be more towards the lower end of the scale. If you were looking for a server that ran kind of virtualized, the Linux HANA server virtualized, and also a Windows virtual server for application hosting, you might be looking at a kind of a higher price tag for all that included. So there's a rough range of costs. Certainly you can spend more on a server. Anybody can also spend more if you've got the latest and greatest of absolutely everything. You don't necessarily have to go on-premise though with your HANA deployment. If you were thinking about having it hosting, you should probably expect anywhere in the neighborhood of $50 per user per month to $100 per user per month. And what does that include? Well, that could include the licensing costs for HANA database, or it may not. And it could also include other things like, you know, licensing costs for Windows Terminal Server and the like. So that's why such a broad range of hosting fees, from the very basic to, you know, more advanced. What would it take to convert? Well, again, this is sort of a difficult question to answer. For anyone that has a very out-of-the-box implementation of Business One, hasn't really done much in the way of custom queries, hasn't done any SDK customizations, isn't really running add-ons, and, you know, hasn't really moved much around, you're likely looking at a level of effort roughly equivalent to a major version upgrade from one version to the next. But you know, this could range to a fairly large project depending on how customized your environment is. So we would certainly have to talk with you, with each client in a more one-on-one basis to sort of understand the you know, the level of customization in their environment. But we're hoping that we've given you a good understanding of what's involved in the data migration to understand, you know, what it would look like. From a knowledge perspective, you know, I think you know, a base expectation could be, you know, you're likely needing people to sit down and watch at least 3 or 4 hours worth of videos to understand the differences. You know, that's for a basic user. But I would think that any Business One power user would probably be spending in order of you know, 20 plus hours, maybe even a week's worth of time, and watching videos and asking questions and that sort of thing. So, you know, there is an investment in kind of training up your users, and some of that happens over time as well. Certainly, if you were to switch, you know, if you were to flip the switch from SQL to HANA, your users would recognize the environment. It's not like functioning in a completely different environment, but in order to leverage some of the new stuff, you're going to want to put some of that time in. But certainly, you know, creating an invoice is the same. So, you know, rest assured that you're not learning an entirely new piece of software. More so, you're putting time in to leverage the new functionality in HANA. Okay, so that really, in a nutshell, is what to expect when you're converting from SAP Business One SQL to SAP Business One HANA. We hope that we've given you kind of a decent picture of kind of what to expect from an effort and a cost perspective. Obviously, every environment is a little bit different. You know, this type of maneuver looks a lot like, you know, what's involved when you upgrade, and certainly there are very similar things at play. If you are running an add-on and you'd like to know whether that add-on is certified for use on HANA, you know, certainly reach out to your consulting contacts or your sustainment manager, and we can answer that question for you.